Hey friends, I'm here again with some new chilling stories. This video is ad-free, so you can sit back and enjoy. Please consider subscribing as it keeps me going. I've always loved yard sales. There's something thrilling about the hunt, the possibility of finding hidden treasures among someone else's junk. So when I saw the sign at the end of the street, estate sale, everything must go, I couldn't resist. It was a warm Saturday morning, and the house hosting the sale stood at the edge of town, slightly dilapidated but full of character. The yard was cluttered with old furniture, boxes of books, vintage knickknacks, and dusty antiques. I parked my car and stepped out, the gravel crunching underfoot. A handful of other shoppers milled about, but the atmosphere felt oddly subdued, as if the house itself was watching us. An elderly woman sat near the entrance, wearing a wide-brimmed hat and thick glasses. She barely acknowledged anyone, nodding absently when someone handed her cash. When I greeted her, she muttered, "Take whatever speaks to you." The way she said it gave me pause, but I smiled politely and wandered off, scanning the items. I spotted a table filled with peculiar items, a tarnished silver mirror, a porcelain doll with cracked cheeks, and a wooden jewelry box. But what caught my eye was a framed painting propped up at the back of the table. It was small, no bigger than a notebook, and depicted a dark, misty forest. In the center stood a shadowy figure, barely discernible but undeniably human-shaped. The detail was haunting. The trees seemed to stretch endlessly, and the figure seemed to shift when I tilted my head, as if it were moving deeper into the woods. "How much for this?" I asked, holding up the painting. The woman in the hat glanced at it, her expression tightening. "That one?" she said, her voice dropping. $5. "But are you sure you want it?" Her question caught me off guard, but I nodded. It was a steal for such an intriguing piece. She hesitated, then sighed. "It's yours. Just be careful where you hang it." I paid her and left, the painting tucked under my arm. Back home, I hung the painting in my living room. It looked perfect against the pale gray wall, its dark tones contrasting beautifully with the bright space. That evening, as I sat on the couch scrolling through my phone, I found myself glancing at the painting more often than I'd like to admit. The shadowy figure in the forest seemed closer. I told myself it was a trick of the light, a product of my imagination. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that crept into my chest. That night, I woke up to a strange noise, a soft, rhythmic tapping. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, and listened. It was coming from the living room. I grabbed my phone for light and tiptoed down the hallway. The tapping grew louder as I approached, like fingernails drumming against glass. When I entered the living room, the sound stopped. The painting was crooked on the wall, tilted slightly to the left. I stared at it, my pulse racing. The figure in the forest was gone. The next morning, I convinced myself it was just a dream. Maybe the painting had shifted when I hung it, and I hadn't noticed. But things only got stranger. I started hearing faint whispers when I was alone, soft and indistinct, like someone speaking just out of earshot. Objects in the house moved inexplicably, keys I'd left on the counter ended up on the floor, doors that I'd shut were suddenly ajar. And the painting. Every time I looked at it, the forest seemed darker, more oppressive, and the figure was always somewhere new, lurking in the shadows. I decided to return to the estate sale. Maybe the woman in the hat could explain what was happening. When I arrived, the house was empty, the yard barren. A for sale sign stood in the lawn, the windows dark and lifeless. Confused, I knocked on the door, but no one answered. A neighbor walking by stopped and gave me a curious look. "Looking for someone?" she asked. "Yes, the woman who had the yard sale last weekend," I said. The neighbor frowned. "There hasn't been anyone living here for months. The house has been vacant since old Mrs. Hargrove passed away." My stomach dropped. "Passed away?" I stammered. "Yeah," she said. "Heart attack, I think. They cleared out most of her stuff a while back, but I guess there's still some junk in there." That night, the whispers turned into full-blown voices. "Come closer," they beckoned. "Join us." I tried to ignore them, locking myself in my bedroom. But the tapping returned, louder this time, insistent. When I finally gathered the courage to check the living room, I froze in terror. The painting was no longer on the wall. It was on the floor, leaning against the couch. The shadowy figure was now standing at the edge of the forest, its hand outstretched, reaching toward the foreground. The air grew icy, and I felt a presence behind me. A voice whispered in my ear, clear as day, "You took me home." I don't remember much after that. I woke up the next morning on the floor, the painting gone. Every now and then, I hear faint whispers in the house, and sometimes, I catch glimpses of a shadow in the corner of my eye. I've tried to move on, but at night, I dream of the forest, dark, endless, and suffocating. And in those dreams, the shadow waits, always closer. It was one of those crisp fall mornings, the kind where the air feels alive and the world seems painted in shades of amber and gold. I had no plans for the day, but then I spotted a hand-painted sign on the side of the road. "Yard sale, 2 miles ahead." Something about it caught my attention. Maybe it was the uneven lettering or the faded red arrow pointing down an old country road. I shrugged and decided to check it out. You never know what treasures you might find. The sale was at an old Victorian house perched on a hill. Its once grand exterior was now peeling and weathered, but the place still exuded a kind of eerie charm. The yard was scattered with mismatched items, antique furniture, old books, faded clothing, and an assortment of peculiar trinkets. It wasn't the usual clutter you'd find at a yard sale. Everything seemed purposeful, like it was waiting for someone. An older man, stooped and gaunt, sat behind a makeshift table. His eyes were sharp, scanning each person who approached. "Let me know if anything calls to you," he said cryptically, his voice low and gravelly. As I wandered through the yard, something tucked beneath an old quilt caught my eye. I pulled back the fabric to reveal an antique oval mirror in a carved wooden frame. The wood was dark and smooth, engraved with strange, almost hypnotic patterns. The glass wasn't perfectly clear, it had a faint smoky hue, like it was holding secrets just out of reach. The strangest part was my reflection. It wasn't quite right. My movements matched perfectly, but there was something in my expression that felt foreign, almost detached. "How much for this?" I asked, lifting the mirror. The old man's face darkened. "That's not for sale," he said quickly. "But it's out here," I pointed out. He hesitated, then sighed. $50. "But if you take it for good. No returns." I handed over the money, feeling a strange mix of excitement and unease as I carried the mirror to my car. The man watched me the entire time, his gaze heavy and unreadable. When I got home, I decided to hang the mirror in my bedroom. It looked beautiful, its dark wood frame contrasting with the soft cream of my walls. That night, I couldn't stop staring at it. The smoky glass seemed to shimmer in the dim light, and once again, my reflection felt off. I told myself it was just my imagination, the result of buying something so old and unusual. But as I turned out the lights and crawled into bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I woke up around 2 a.m. to a faint sound. It was soft at first, like a distant rustling. I sat up, straining to listen. It was coming from the mirror. When I turned on the light, the sound stopped. But my reflection didn't look right. My face was pale, my eyes wide with fear, even though I was trying to stay calm. I moved closer, and my reflection tilted its head, just slightly, as if studying me. I stumbled backward, knocking over a lamp. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the glass. My reflection was back to normal, but I knew what I'd seen. The next morning, I decided to take a closer look at the mirror. I noticed faint carvings on the back of the wooden frame, symbols I didn't recognize. They looked ancient, like something out of a history book. I spent the day researching, trying to figure out what the symbols meant, but I found nothing. Frustrated, I decided to let it go. That night, the strange noises returned. This time, it was louder, a low whispering, just barely audible. I tried to ignore it, but when I looked at the mirror, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A handprint. It was faint, pressed against the inside of the glass. The days that followed were a blur of unease and sleepless nights. The whispers grew louder, sometimes breaking into soft, mocking laughter. And the handprint wasn't alone anymore. Shadows moved behind the glass, shapes that didn't belong to me or my reflection. One night, as I stared in fear, I saw it. A figure stood in the smoky haze of the glass. It was tall, featureless, and impossibly still. Then it stepped forward. The surface of the mirror rippled like water as the figure moved closer, its outline sharpening. I stumbled backward, my heart racing, but when I blinked, it was gone. I knew I couldn't keep the mirror any longer. I tried taking it down, but the screws wouldn't budge. I even tried breaking the glass, but the mirror remained intact, as if it were mocking me. In desperation, I returned to the old Victorian house. The man was gone, and the house looked even more abandoned than before. The yard was empty, the sign gone. A neighbor told me the house had been vacant for years, that no one had lived there since the original owner, a collector of cursed antiques, had died. I felt sick. That night, the whispers became deafening. They weren't just sounds anymore, they were words. "Come closer," they said. "Let us in." The mirror began to glow faintly, the smoky surface swirling like a storm. I tried to leave the room, but the door wouldn't open. The air grew thick, suffocating, and I felt an unseen force pulling me toward the glass. The figure reappeared, clearer than ever, its hand pressed against the inside of the mirror. Slowly, it leaned forward, its face inches from mine. I closed my eyes and screamed, the world around me dissolving into chaos. When I woke up, the mirror. I've never been a fan of yard sales, but when my best friend Sarah insisted we check out an estate sale in the old part of town, I didn't have much of a choice. The house was massive and eerie, with ivy crawling up its faded brick walls and shutters hanging loosely. It looked like the kind of place that had more secrets than treasures. The front yard was cluttered with old furniture, boxes of knickknacks, and various antiques that seemed to hum with age. I wasn't interested in any of it until Sarah pointed to a doll sitting in a rocking chair. It was the most lifelike doll I'd ever seen, about the size of a toddler, dressed in a frilly white dress that looked freshly cleaned despite its age. Its porcelain face was eerily perfect, with glassy blue eyes that seemed to follow you wherever you moved. "I dare you to buy it," Sarah teased. "No thanks," I muttered, but something about the doll wouldn't let me look away. It almost felt alive. Before I knew it, the elderly woman running the sale approached us. Her eyes lit up when she saw me looking at the doll. "You like her?" she asked with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Her name is Abigail. She's been with our family for generations." I didn't know why, but I felt compelled to buy it. $20 later, Abigail was mine, sitting eerily still in the passenger seat as I drove home. I placed the doll in a corner of my living room, on an old chair I rarely used. Its glassy eyes seemed to sparkle in the dim light, watching me as I went about my evening. That night, I woke to a strange creaking sound, like the gentle rocking of a chair. My heart raced as I realized it was coming from the living room. I crept out of bed and peeked around the corner. The chair was rocking back and forth, slow and steady, but Abigail hadn't moved. Her glassy eyes stared straight ahead. I told myself it must have been a draft and went back to bed, but sleep didn't come easy. Over the next few days, strange things began happening. I'd find Abigail in different positions, her head tilted, her hands resting on her lap when I was sure they had been at her sides. Once, I found her in a completely different chair across the room. At first, I thought Sarah was playing a prank on me, but when I confronted her, she swore she hadn't been in my house since the day I bought the doll. The creaking sounds continued every night. Sometimes, I'd hear faint giggles, soft and high-pitched, like a child playing hide-and-seek. One night, unable to take it anymore, I decided to lock Abigail in the basement. I carried her down the creaky stairs, her glassy eyes seeming to glare at me with every step. As I placed her on a dusty shelf, I noticed something carved into the back of her neck, Abigail 1893, and a series of strange symbols I didn't recognize. That night, the whispers began. They started softly, like a gentle breeze brushing against my ears, but soon grew louder, filling my bedroom with chilling words I couldn't understand. I ran to the basement, determined to get rid of the doll once and for all. But when I opened the door, Abigail was gone. I found her back in the living room, sitting on the chair where I'd first placed her. But she wasn't alone. The air around her seemed to shimmer, and I could make out the faint outline of a figure, a little girl with hollow eyes and a malicious grin. "You shouldn't have taken me," she whispered, her voice echoing in my head. Before I could react, the lights flickered, and the room was plunged into darkness. I felt a cold hand brush against my arm, and then everything went silent. I woke up in my bed, gasping for air. The doll was gone. The chair was empty, and the living room looked perfectly normal. But when I glanced at the corner, I froze. On the wall, scrawled in what looked like ash, were the words, "You can't get rid of me." To this day, I hear faint giggles at night, and sometimes, when I least expect it, I catch a glimpse of glassy blue eyes watching me from the shadows. Yard sales weren't really my thing, but that weekend, I needed a distraction. My car had been acting up, work was suffocating, and I'd been feeling off, like something was missing in my life. A small, handwritten sign caught my eye as I was driving down an unfamiliar back road. "Yard sale, antiques and curiosities." The house was old but charming, tucked away behind overgrown hedges. The yard was cluttered with odds and ends, old clocks, rusty tools, faded books, but my attention was drawn to a small table near the porch. On it sat a delicate wooden music box. It wasn't flashy, just a plain mahogany box with a small crank on the side. It looked like something from the 1800s, its edges worn smooth from use. I couldn't explain why, but I felt like the box was waiting for me. An elderly woman, dressed in black with a faded shawl, appeared beside me without warning. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she said, her voice crackling like dry leaves. I nodded. "How much?" Her expression darkened, as if she were debating whether to sell it at all. $10, she finally said. "But it comes with a warning, never play it at midnight." I smirked. Why? Does a ghost pop out? She didn't smile back. It calls them. I laughed nervously, handed her the money, and walked back to my car with the box under my arm. I chalked her words up to some gimmicky sales pitch. That night, I set the box on my coffee table. I turned the small crank, and soft, haunting music began to. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before, slow, almost hypnotic, like a lullaby sung underwater. The tune lingered in my mind long after it stopped, leaving me unsettled. I checked the time, 11:52 p.m. The woman's warning flashed through my mind, but curiosity got the better of me. "It's just a box," I whispered, and turned the crank again. The melody played softly at first. But as the clock ticked closer to midnight, the tune grew louder, more chaotic, like the gears inside were grinding faster. The box shook slightly in my hands. Then, the music stopped. At first, the silence was deafening. Then came the knocking. It came from the front door. I froze, my skin prickling. Who would be visiting me this late? I crept toward the peephole. No one was there. I exhaled shakily and turned around, only to hear knocking again. This time, it came from the back door. The knocks grew louder, spreading to the windows, the walls, as if something, many somethings, were outside, surrounding my home. I backed into the living room, my pulse hammering in my ears. A shadow passed across the window. I couldn't see its shape, only the outline, a tall, distorted figure with limbs that moved like liquid. The air grew heavy, like the house itself was holding its breath. I grabbed the music box, my mind racing. "What do you want?" I shouted. From behind me, a voice whispered, "Play it again." I turned, but no one was there. My hands trembled as I stared. "Play it," the voice whispered again. Closer this time, as though it were just inches from my ear. Without thinking, I cranked the handle. The melody began to play, the same haunting tune, but now it seemed to be answering something outside. The knocking stopped. The shadows vanished. And then, silence. The next morning, I didn't sleep. I stared at the music box, afraid to touch it, afraid to turn away from it. The woman's warning echoed in my mind, "It calls them." I grabbed the box, drove back to the house, and pounded on the door. The same woman answered, her face unreadable. "You played it, didn't you?" she said, more a statement than a question. I nodded, my voice hoarse. "What is it? What did it call?" She sighed, taking the box from my hands. "It's a beacon," she said. "For things that shouldn't be here. Things that wait." "Can I get rid of it?" I asked desperately. She shook her head. "You cannot invite them. They know you now." I woke up that night to the sound of music playing softly from the living room. My chest tightened as I realized, the box was back. It sat on the coffee table, the crank turning on its own. The shadows outside my window stretched and moved, pressing against the glass like they were trying to get in. The melody grew louder, drowning out my panicked breathing. And then, from behind me, I heard the whisper again. "Let us in." I turned around, but everything went black. It was a quiet Saturday morning when I found myself driving aimlessly through the countryside. I didn't have a destination, just a need to get out, clear my mind. Work had been relentless, my social life non-existent, and my apartment had started to feel like a prison. I guess I thought fresh air would help, but I wasn't prepared for what I stumbled upon. A small, faded sign nailed to a tree caught my eye as I turned down an unfamiliar road, "Yard Sale, Antiques and Curiosities." Something about the word curiosities intrigued me. I pulled into the driveway of an old farmhouse that looked like it had been pulled straight out of a 19th century painting. The shutters were weathered, the roof sagging slightly, and ivy crept up the walls like fingers trying to pull the house back into the earth. The yard was littered with mismatched tables covered in items, a strange mix of junk and treasure. There were porcelain dolls with cracked faces, tarnished silverware, stacks of faded books, and ancient tools that looked more like instruments of torture than farming equipment. I wandered through the tables, sifting absent-mindedly, until I noticed something near the back of the yard. It was a painting, propped against the garage. The painting was large, about 3 feet tall and 2 feet wide, encased in an ornate golden frame that had lost most of its luster. The image itself was unsettling, a family of 4 standing in front of an old farmhouse. The father stood tall with dark, empty eyes that seemed to follow me, while the mother held a lifeless expression, her lips turned slightly downward. The 2 children, a boy and a girl, were eerily still. But it wasn't the family's faces that disturbed me the most. It was the house in the background. It was the same house where the yard sale was taking place. "Beautiful piece, isn't it?" The voice startled me. I turned to see an older man with sunken cheeks and deep wrinkles standing behind me. He wore a faded flannel shirt and overalls, his eyes clouded but sharp. Yeah. How much?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He scratched his chin. $10, if you promise to take care of it." $10 for such a massive painting? It felt too easy. "What's the catch?" I asked, half joking. The man's face darkened. "Some things don't like being forgotten. It's better that it has a home." I laughed nervously, handed him the cash, and carried the painting to my car. As I lifted it into the back seat, I could have sworn the little girl's head was tilted slightly to the side, her eyes meeting mine. I shook the thought away and drove off, eager to get home. Back in my apartment, I decided the painting would be perfect above the couch. I lived alone, and the walls were mostly bare, so the place could use a little character, even if that character came in the form of a creepy old painting. I hammered a nail into the wall, stepped back, and hung the frame. The family stared back, their eyes still dark, their expressions frozen. I couldn't help but feel like the painting didn't belong in my clean, modern living room. That night, as I was settling into bed, I swore I heard a faint tapping sound coming from the living room. I told myself it was probably the heat clicking on or the pipes settling. Old buildings always make noise. I rolled over and forced myself to sleep. The next morning, I woke up feeling uneasy. I walked into the living room to grab my phone, but when I glanced at the painting, I froze. Something was different. The family had moved. The little girl, who had been standing with her hands clasped, now had one arm extended, as if she were pointing at me. I felt my heart race, and a cold sweat prickled my skin. I backed away, staring at the painting, trying to convince myself I was imagining it. I grabbed my phone and opened the picture I'd taken of the yard sale the day before. In the photo, the girl's hands were clasped, just like I remembered. But here, in the painting on my wall, her arm was pointing. "Maybe I'm overtired," I muttered, rubbing my eyes. "Or I'm losing my mind." I left the apartment for the day, just to clear my head, but when I came home that evening, the painting had changed again. The family, who had been standing in front of the farmhouse, were now closer to the edge of the frame, as though they were walking forward. The father's dark eyes seemed more hollow, and the boy's head was turned in. I ripped the painting off the wall and stuffed it into the hall closet. "Enough of this," I said aloud, trying to convince myself that everything would go back to normal. That night, the tapping sound woke me again. It was louder this time, rhythmic, coming from inside the apartment. I sat up, heart pounding, and grabbed my phone to use as a flashlight. The tapping was coming from the closet. I crept toward it, every muscle in my body tense. My breathing grew shallow as I reached for the door handle. The tapping stopped. I hesitated, then flung the door open. The painting was there, resting against the wall. But the family. They were gone. The canvas was empty except for the farmhouse in the background. A cold chill ran down my spine. I turned to scan the room, and froze. In the dim glow of my phone's flashlight, I saw faint outlines of footprints, small, muddy prints that started at the closet and led toward the living room. And then I heard it. A whisper. It was faint, like wind slipping through cracks in the walls, but I could make out the words. "We're here." Panic overtook me. I grabbed the painting, sprinted to my car, and drove out of the city. I didn't care where I went, I just knew I had to get rid of it. I stopped at an old bridge that crossed a river miles outside of town. With trembling hands, I pulled the painting from the car. The family was back in the frame, their dark eyes staring at me, their mouth twisted into grotesque smiles. Without hesitation, I heaved the painting over the railing. I watched as it crashed into the water below and disappeared beneath the current. I stood there for a long time, my heart pounding in my ears. I whispered to myself, "It's over." When I returned to my apartment later that night, I finally felt relief. I poured myself a drink, collapsed onto the couch, and let my body relax for the first time in days. But as I glanced up at the wall where the painting had hung, my blood ran cold. There, on the wall, were faint, muddy handprints, 4 of them, as if someone had been pressing against it from the other side. And then I heard it again. That slow, rhythmic tapping. But this time, it was coming from inside the walls.